It's a great pleasure to see you all. This is our second virtual WADM Wednesday. We've got well over 100 participants, which is a great pleasure for us. This is 8th week, Wednesday of 8th week, so we're nearly at the end of term. Probably one of the strangest terms in the history of Wadham College. Teaching has all been delivered online, and most of our students away from the college, about 60 still here, who either live overseas or can't safely go home, and we're very happy to accommodate them. Finals in full swing. Our students have borne the crisis with tremendous fortitude and an impressive degree of calmness, and our fellows have taken to virtual teaching in an impressive way. So things have been better perhaps than we might have imagined at the beginning of this crisis. And I think the community spirit in Wadham and the sense of solidarity associated with this college has seen us in very good stead. We're hoping to welcome our students back in Michaelmas and are confident that that will happen. And thank you all for your support and encouragement and emails over this period. It's always good. I hope soon you'll be able to visit us again in person. Tonight's event is directly associated with the pandemic because a few weeks ago, a group of our fellows came together to work on what was then a pressing international problem, which was the lack of ventilators to deal with people who were falling seriously ill as a result of this new virus. And their story, I think, is quite an extraordinary one. It's one that inspired the Wadham community and made us quite proud, actually, to be associated with this effort. And we're very pleased to share it with you this evening. We're going to be joined by our tutorial fellow in medicine, Dr. Andrew Farmery, by our two of our tutorial fellows in engineering, Dr. Mark Thompson and Dr. Alfonso Castro John Peter, and by a visiting fellow of Wadham. Well, he will be a visiting fellow starting in Michaelmas, but we're treating him tonight as an advanced guest visiting fellow, and we're delighted to have him, Dr. Federico Fomenti of King's College, London. They're going to tell us for 15 minutes or so, maybe 20 minutes or so, the history of the development of this ventilator and perhaps the future of this project as well. When they've described that to us, we're going to throw this open for a general conversation, and please do feel free to become involved in that. So without my taking up any more time, I'm going to hand over now to Andrew to introduce this event. Andrew.
Thank you very much, Warden. I don't know if my video is working. Tell me if it isn't.
It is.
Good. Well, I'm speaking from my room in Wadham College. Most of you will not have been in this room, I guess, but all of you will have walked underneath it because this is the room that's above the gatehouse, the one through which everybody walks as they enter and exit the college. And this is the room where the first mechanical ventilator was designed and built some 350 years ago. Because this is the room where the preeminent group of natural philosophers met under the chairmanship of the Warden Wilkins, the likes of Christopher Wren, Robert Hooke, Robert Boyle, Seth Ward, Richard Lower, these great polymaths who were answering and investigating the important questions around the natural world at the time. And one of the things they wanted to investigate was what was the purpose of the lung. You might think that that was obvious by that stage, but it didn't appear to have been. So to facilitate an experiment, Hooke and Wren built a mechanical ventilator, a sophisticated device with two bellows operating in antiphase to produce a constant flow of gas into the trachea of a dog, which they cannulated with a brass tube. So some 353 years ago, this is where the first mechanical ventilator was designed. So it was particularly significant, and with some sort of symbolic, historic recapitulation that four Wadham Fellows set out to revisit this task at the time of crisis in the middle of March. So I'll hand over to Mark now to tell you a little of the narrative of how it all began.
Mark, you may be muted because we can't hear you.
Unmute, right. Sorry about that. So
it was just over,
you can hear me now. So it was just over the weekend of the 16th, before the 16th of March, that the government announced the UK Ventilator Challenge. The stark situation was that there was a projected deficit of 18,000 ventilators at the peak pandemic in the UK. And the UK at that point had an annual capacity of manufacturing 2,000. So I had a supervision meeting with my DPhil student, Robert Starruch, who is an honorary engineer, a medic with performing a DPhil in engineering science. And he said to me, shouldn't the Department of Engineering Science in Oxford be doing ventilators? And so we jumped on the phone and talked to the obvious candidate, an anaesthetist who has an honorary engineering title as well, Andrew, and rapidly were introduced to Fede. And we set about putting together a team which expanded rapidly, also to include Alfonso and huge amounts of support from across the engineering department. So we got to work really quickly. This is a picture of the workshop. Fede in the bottom left note the position of Professor Farmery and the drawing pad and the sketch pad and all the paraphernalia. So there was a lot of prototyping in the first week. And we were pretty proud when on the following Monday, we pitched our design to the Cabinet Office. At that point, social distancing had just come in, it was a novelty. And we were slightly awkwardly sitting in the conference room at the top of this Tom building and pitching our design to the Cabinet Office over teleconference, which is also a novelty. And a key part of the pitch was a video, which I'm just about to show you, but Alfonso can tell you a little bit about the background to the video while I do the mechanics.
Cool. Can you hear me? Yes, I'm sure you can hear me. So, well, as Mark and Andrew mentioned, just a few hours after we came up with the design, with what we thought would work, we started recruiting a lot of students, a lot of very skilled students with completely different skills. Of course, nobody in the department had been building ventilators before, so we grabbed experienced students from all sorts of backgrounds. Some of them very good in building things with their hands, some of them building things with 3D printers, some of them with a lot of experience in electronics, for example, or control. And in this case, as Mark said, we have to present something in our pitch to the Cabinet Office. So we prepared this little video. As you can see, this is a picture, well, it's a movie, but you will see this, my student, who is a physicist, started this year doing a PhD on droplets, which had nothing to do with ventilators, but his experience on all sorts of key skills that we needed were fundamental for the development of this ventilator. So Mark, if you can run it.
Allow me to present the OxVent. This system takes in standard 4-bar air, here supplied by a canister, but available as standard in all NHS hospitals. This comes through a small solenoid valve with an electronic control system, more on that later, and is driven into this box. Inside the box is a standard ambulance bag. These bags are normally compressed by hand to provide air to a patient, but in this case we compress it using the pressure from our air supply. This is then used to ventilate the patient, and a valve allows the patient's lungs to relax. As you can see, here they are inflating to quite a large tidal volume, but we might want to change that. A primary care practitioner has some very simple options for controlling this. There are 3 key parameters they're interested in: the tidal volume, the respiratory rate in breaths per minute, and the I/E ratio, respectively controlled by these 3 knobs and set by these 3 buttons. To set a new value, in this case I'm going to decrease the tidal volume from 450-ish to around 400, We push the button to set it, and that is reflected here. As we can see now, the bag is compressed less, and the lungs inflate less also. Likewise, I'm going to now use the box to increase the rate. We're now at 17 breaths per minute. And lastly, I'm going to use the box to set an ID ratio of 1 to 2, compared to the 1 to 1 that we started this demonstration with.
So as you can see, we were very proud of our prototype design, and we were successful in pitching to the government, and as a result of which we were paired with Smith & Nephew, with more specifically with their wound division, their wound care division in Hull. And this was an inspired pairing for two reasons. The first is the technology involved. So this is a pneumatic ventilator, and the wound care division, Smith & Nephew, manufacture a device for negative pressure wound therapy, which is a pneumatic device. So they had the right manufacturing technology skills already. They also had a similar perspective on their participation in the ventilator challenge. They had no long-term wish to move commercially into manufacturing ventilators, and so we're prepared to see this as a pro bono project for the benefit of the UK and of the wider public. So this slide also shows how large the team was. Over the three institutions involved, there were over 70 people who were directly involved in this work. And over the course of the project, a team from Oxford and King's went up to Hull and worked alongside our colleagues in Smith & Nephew intensely to meet very tight deadlines for submitting devices and paperwork to the UK Medical Devices Regulator, the MHRA, for testing. And the government updated the specifications a number of times, which left us running very quickly to catch up. So Andrew may have also some additional reminiscences about the time in Hull.
Yes, we had some fun in Hull. There were in all 10 people from Oxford went up to the Smith & Nephew factory, including professors, postdocs, DPhil students, and a medical student. We stayed in a deserted Holiday Inn without a bar and without a restaurant. Not that we had time to eat or do anything like that, because we were, particularly the electronics and the software guys, were working round the clock. They were coding away throughout the day and the night. How they kept going, I don't know. We had a tight deadline to get a device off, a final manufactured device off to be tested by the MHRA. And the day before it was meant to go, we still had printed circuit boards in a factory in Hampshire. They needed to be in Humberside. Her Majesty the Queen kindly lent us her private helicopter to fly them there. We installed them, programmed them, and tempers were all a bit frayed, and we all fell out with each other at various points. But by the day that we got it off to Birmingham for testing, we were all friends. And I think the next slide probably shows the relief and joy of packing up these prototypes into boxes and shipping them for testing. And I think that was in the first week of April. So very, very shortly after we got the green light to get going with it. So it was a very tight and sweaty experience, but one that had a good result. So a little bit about the technology of this. At the time we were told we needed, or the country would need 28,000 ventilators in a matter of weeks. Now that information shapes how you design something. With global supply chains completely strangled, you don't have the luxury of simply building a ventilator, the likes of which already exist. You have to think laterally and out of the box. So we came up with the notion that it's going to have to be simple. It's going to have very few components and almost no moving parts to make it robust. And in order to make it scalable in the sort of numbers that we need, it just needed to be simple enough to be makeable, but also functional. And what we modeled it on was a little picture you can see in the top, which is Medtronic's very first external cardiac pacemaker from the 1960s. A very simple device compared to today's pacemakers. On it, you'll see an on-off switch and a dial that turns up the pulse rate up or down. It was very simple, but it keeps you alive. That's what was said of that device in the 1960s, and that was our watchword when we built this ventilator. In order to make the number we needed, it would have to be simple, but if it kept you alive, that's what all we needed it for at the time. So the next slide shows what was made a week or so later in Hull. The compressive part at the bottom is a Perspex box containing an air bladder that is compressed by compressed air. And that's very simple, but the control system is actually quite complex. For any engineers in the audience, it incorporates what's called a closed loop feedback control system. So there are sensors in the device that monitor its flow and volume and pressure and time cycles, and adjust the input signals to the compressed air valve according to how you set it. So it's a precise control, but a pretty basic pneumatic fundamental principle. And I think that's, yeah, it concludes that section.
So this sort of ventilator fits in its own niche within the ventilator market. So there, you may well have been aware of a number of kind of built from scratch ventilator designs that received a lot of publicity. Most of those were in fact cheaper than OxVent, but even more rudimentary and without any basic safety features. OxVent itself costs about, in terms of materials, costs around about £1,000, which makes it at least a tenth, if not smaller, fraction of the cost of a normal clinically standard ventilator. So clearly it doesn't offer such a high amount of sophistication in the features that are available, but we feel that this gives it a really interesting perspective on the market. When you have a ventilator, you have to test it, of course. It's one thing to test a single prototype in a lab in Oxford and to show that, for example, here, the tidal volume that's delivered is similar to the one that you dial in. It's a completely different proposition to show that your manufacturing line can churn out 5,000 a week, which all have the same appropriate response to the input parameters and provide the same output for that, and to show the variability. It's a statistical exercise, and it becomes a lot more technical. For example, we in the latest update, we installed an automated testing routine into the manufacturing line to facilitate this. So actually, we're delighted, of course, that the UK did not need OxVent in the end. The UK pandemic took a different course, although many people have died. And that is a tragedy for the nation, that the hospitals were not overwhelmed and there were no shortages of ventilators. So that is a positive result. But as a result of that fact, OxVent lost two extremely large and interesting partners, the government and Smith & Nephew, as a result of which we are now a lot smaller and a lot more flexible and maneuverable. So we are now addressing the international demand for ventilators. This graph here shows starkly the situation developing in Brazil. If you can see, there's a very faint green line, straight green line towards the bottom of the graph, which shows the actual ICU bed capacity. And the dotted line shows the projected requirement with the error bars shaded in. So OxVent has a role both within COVID-19. We also are hearing, as a result of developing our understanding of the international situation, it seems that it also may have a role as a low-cost ventilator beyond COVID-19, for example, for C-section surgery in low and middle income countries. So to meet those demands, two parallel efforts are going forward. One, a research project within King's College and the University of Oxford, and one, a joint venture not-for-profit social enterprise spin-out. And we'll talk a little bit about what both of those things are doing. So I hand over to Fede to talk about the research that's planned within King's and Oxford.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, so this slide summarizes the main points for the OxVent research aims. And one of my roles is like coordinating the ongoing research aspects of the project. Fundamentally, we'd like to determine the effectiveness of this ventilator, and we would like to do that in comparison with both standard ventilators, but also in a different context from the UK. Obviously, the comparison, unfortunately, is going to be between having the possibility to be ventilated on OxVent and not being able to be ventilated. So we will perform a clinical evaluation initially at St. Thomas's Hospital in London, and later on likely in Mexico or Brazil or other countries where OxVent may be used for clinical reasons in COVID-19. As Mark briefly mentioned, we think that there is a wide potential for impact globally in terms of increasing critical care capacity and access to emergency surgery by providing a relatively affordable mechanical ventilator. And so we proposed to the Wellcome Trust a project that would include this clinical evaluation and also the development of a second version of OxVent, which has been an incredible achievement in the last 2-3 months, but I'm sure we all agree that we can improve on what has been done in 2-3 months if we have a little longer time and more resources. And as a consequence, we are liaising with a number of low and middle income countries to appreciate the infrastructure and the local requirements so that the design and development of the next version of OxVent meets the local needs. So that's it for me in terms of the research aims. I'm happy to take questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Fede. So the social enterprise is addressing the more commercial aspect of deploying the ventilator. We're beginning to build partnerships with manufacturers in Latin America, in Brazil and in Mexico. We are approaching regulators to achieve regulatory authorization. So we're going to the FDA in the States, although we do not really intend to deploy the ventilator in the States, but because the FDA is currently the gold standard for emergency use authorization. So the UK route for emergency approval was stopped as a result of the lack of clinical demand for emergency ventilators. So the FDA is the highest standard that we could achieve. So we want to have that recognition for the project, but we're also, of course, approaching the regulators in Brazil and in Mexico. And the social enterprise is also looking for funding, needless to say. All of those activities require us to build a network. This identifies some of the people with whom we are already in contact. Global health foundations, regulators, academic collaborators, academic institutions in Mexico and Brazil, and the regulators and governmental organizations in Mexico and Brazil. That pretty much wraps it all up. I'm sure we're all delighted to be available for questions now, and also to hear, perhaps by email or other channels, if you have any other follow-up in the future. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you this evening.
I think it may be muted, Ken, sorry.
Sorry, I'm muted, yeah. I was just asking you to go back to the normal screen, but you've already done that, Mark. Can I just kick off by asking you, I mean, first of all, I'm absolutely full of admiration for what you all achieved in such a short period of time. But I wonder, what's your sense of how far this project could go? I mean, you've just shown us a kind of web of contacts and relationships, which looks quite big and complex. And getting into markets like Brazil, for example, presumably could be quite difficult logistically. So I wonder what's your sense of the next, say, 6 to 12 months?
So the acute phase response, we will be attempting. So we were motivated initially by addressing wave 1 of the COVID pandemic, and we were all. I think the loss of the 2 large partners, government and Smith and Nephew, took us some time to adjust to. It's quite an experience working on a government project and then suddenly not anymore. And similarly, it's quite an experience working with a global healthcare company and then suddenly not anymore. I think we were all initially motivated by addressing the first wave. And so we want to do that. We believe our ventilator has a special role to play because of its rapid manufacturability. So we are attempting as far as possible to exploit that and to allow others to benefit from that. Yeah. And Mexico and Brazil have the right combination of healthcare infrastructure, which is relatively developed. For example, the provision of 4-bar air in hospitals is to be relied upon. So those, for our technology, those seem to be a good fit. And there is also a huge demand, as we are aware, through letters from 5 governors of 5 states in Mexico. So I think it's highly likely that we will find a manufacturer, maybe Alfonso can follow up after me, in the next few days and sign an agreement with them and license the design and the manufacturing information to them as soon as we have it within OxVent Limited itself. So there's some due diligence processes ongoing within the university to transfer that IP, well, to license the IP to the OxVent social enterprise. Okay. So I think if we can navigate our way through those processes effectively and efficiently, there's a very good chance that we will be involved in deploying via a manufacturer in Latin America thousands of OxVents within a couple of months. Longer term, there is a different perspective. Again, with low-cost ventilators, and Fede can also speak about that. But I guess there are 2 different time periods, and they have different numbers attached to them.
That's extraordinary. Yeah. Did Alfonso, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. Well, what I can say is that after this market analysis that was carried out at Oxford and identifying Mexico and Brazil as probably the best places to start with, so we have been working on this for now 3 or 4 weeks and using every single key person that we know in these countries to the point in which now we can talk directly through the embassies, both the Mexican embassy in Mexico and the British embassy in Mexico, and who have put us through all sorts of key contacts throughout Mexico. For example, key universities that would happy to contribute, key manufacturers who are looking to help, companies as big as Siemens, for example, willing to help us bring these ventilators to Central North America, South America.
Okay. Fede, did you want to add anything?
Yes, I think it's been very interesting to start with an initial target that then we were all very glad in a way to moved away, but realizing within that period of time that there's possibly a much greater impact for this type of ventilators on a global scale in the long term that goes way beyond COVID-19. So yes, we're still aiming in the short term to meet a demand, for example, in Mexico during the COVID-19 crisis, but we're also bearing in mind the wider need in a larger scenario, for which, as I mentioned earlier, we're seeking support from the Wellcome Trust. And in that sense, I think that one of the key different points in terms of our approach is what we call a ground-up approach, in that we're not obviously the first ones thinking of these development of these ventilators, but where several have not achieved their targets in the past is in that it's often been the case of somebody in the Western world thinking of what could be helpful somewhere else, developing something and then taking it to wherever else. And that hasn't quite helped developing the situation, whereas we're taking the opposite approach, in that first we see what is required and then we develop our OxVent further so that those requirements are met.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting. I'm going to throw it open now for general discussion. If you want to ask a question, could you click on the participants button at the bottom of the screen if you move your cursor, and then click the hand function so that your hand comes up. We've got a couple of questions on the chat and also a couple on the hand. I think the first questioner was, could you introduce yourselves and tell us when you're at Wadham and what you studied when you ask a question. The first questioner is Samuel Greenhart.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
Certainly can.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks everybody for the talk. Really enjoyed it. My name's Sam. I did medicine at Wadham from 2011 to 2017. I had a question just about the device on a level about the internal sort of technical what it could do. The first video you showed us showed tidal volume, IE ratio, and respiratory rate. But you said there was a lot of coding that went on, and the second box you showed looked a lot more complex computer control maybe. I was wondering what sort of settings and things are possible within OxVent in terms of maybe like CPAP or PEEP, which are continuous positive airway pressure, or positive end expiratory pressure. And is there plans for the future versions of the device to have that in? Thanks.
If I may answer that, hello, Sam. It's a good question. When it started off, it was a basic, what's called volume controlled ventilator, because we were anticipating needing to make 28,000 in 2 weeks. But as the goalposts kept getting moved, we had to make it a little bit more sophisticated and more sophisticated. And its current embodiment, it's still a volume control ventilator, but you can adjust PEEP, IE ratio, tidal volume, respiratory rate, and of course inspired oxygen concentration. So it's a reasonably sophisticated ventilator, but it's not the sort you would find on an ITU. It's more the sort you would find in an operating theatre. We do have a design for a more sophisticated pressure control ventilator, which is just waiting in the wings to be sort of thought about. But we also have the facility for spontaneous breathing support as well. So when the ventilator detects when a patient who is recovering tries to take a breath by themselves, this is sensed, and the ventilator then just assists the spontaneous breathing. So it's a way of weaning the patient off the ventilator. Patients get quite lazy when they've been on a ventilator, as you know, for a few, and they need a lot of sort of gentle encouragement to start doing the work themselves. And so the OxVent currently does that. But we have plans to make a more sophisticated one.
Okay. Charlotte Eberhard has a question on chat, which has been answered. I'd like to bring that online. And the question is, are there any modes available like CPAP or BPAP? Is that how you pronounce those? So, Fedi, I think you've got another. Sorry, Charlotte, could you expand on that question so that we understand it?
No, it's actually fine. So it was answered by the other guy who just asked. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so Fedi, you've answered that online. If anyone wants to see the answer to that, it's on the chat. Okay. Bhawani Singh Rahor has got a question.
Hi, I studied law at Oxford at Wadham from 2013 to 2016. My question is actually about if one is considering investing in the project. Obviously, one would have to ask a lot of questions, but if one wants to invest starting with a small amount, would it be possible to get a team of scientists who would could be employed, or would one have to do it oneself?
Who wants to answer that? Andrew, do you want to answer that?
Well, I think that's probably more for Mark, actually.
Okay, Mark.
We are looking for funding, as I said. At the moment, we are so OxVent is a not-for-profit social enterprise. So it is a public limited company, sorry, a private limited company. So it will have shares, but it will have written into its articles of association that it will be not-for-profit. So it won't pay dividends. We certainly would be interested in understanding if there were funding available. We have a pitch deck, so we would be open to a discussion about what that funding might represent, and how OxVent might what interests the funder might be promoting. So there's the social enterprise is set up in order to be able to provide consultancy, and it will require funding to keep going. It will have a startup fund, hopefully, from the universities. We're bidding for that at the moment. So there are, as you are probably well aware, there are going to be huge legal costs involved in setting up all the contracts for manufacturing and for licensing the technology. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I'm sure we'd be delighted to talk more offline if that would be of interest.
Okay. Che-Yu Chang has a question about energy consumption. Do you want to ask that question?
Yeah. Hello. My name is Che-Yu, and I'm in Oxford, and I major in energy system program, a master program. So currently, my study or my research is about. We would like to know before and after COVID-19, the energy consumption, the drop, the condition of the difference. And we think about in the future, the ventilation will be an important part, or it will be a change a lot because of the safety requirements. So due to the safety consideration, do you think that in the future the energy consumption of ventilation will increase a lot, or our new technology actually we have a more higher energy efficiency? So we would like to predict the future energy consumption, especially of the ventilation.
I'll have a go. I'm only an honorary engineer, of course, bear that in mind. There's the energy involved in building a ventilator, you know, building steel and that sort of stuff. And there's the energy involved in running a ventilator, which is relatively trivial. The device that we have built will run off a battery for an hour. So that gives you an idea about how low the energy consumption of the electronics is, at least, and the solenoid, the proportional solenoid valve. Of course, most of the work is done by compressed air, and that's quite a bit of work. And in order to produce 4 atmosphere compressed air, you need a compressor, and most compressors are run by electricity or by diesel or whatever. So the energy cost of the compressed air is not insignificant.
There's another aspect, which is that with a volume control ventilator, you're delivering a precise amount of gas in comparison with a pressure control ventilator, which delivers a huge amount of gas, only a fraction of which actually goes into the patient. So in terms of efficiency of, for example, compressed oxygen, the volume control design is much more efficient.
And in terms of oxygen consumption, which is important because our device uses very little oxygen, probably 4, 5, 6 liters a minute, whereas a full spec ITU ventilator might use 20 or 30 liters a minute. And if you've got lots of these ventilators in the hospital, all of a sudden the pressure in the oxygen pipeline starts to drop and you're in trouble. So in terms of oxygen usage, it's very efficient.
Okay. Nigel Pluck, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, I am Red Medicine from 80 to 85. And my D-field supervisor was Bob Williams, who I think was also in the room above the lodge. But I was more, I was more interested in the power of OxVent, whether it was strong enough delivery to inflate lungs that have been heavily infected by coronavirus, or would it actually have propensity to pop the lungs, which is not going to be a very good idea.
That sounds quite alarming.
The MHRA put quite strict specifications on what the ventilator should do. It's true that stiff, inflamed lungs from COVID pneumonitis and any pneumonitis means that it's very difficult to inflate the lungs, and to get just a little bit of air in requires a lot of pressure. There's no avoiding that. That's just part of the disease. But the requirements are that we had to set a pressure limit above which the ventilator could not overpressure. And that we had a fail-safe. There was a mechanical valve that would pop at 40 centimeters of water, and we had a software control which prevented the solenoid overpressuring above 35 centimeters of water. So it was physically impossible to overpressure. Of course, the consequence of that is you might not get much air in, but it's safer to underventilate a patient than to hammer air in and risk causing a pneumothorax or a rupture of the pleura around the lungs. So it has built-in safety features like that because we were required to.
That sounds reassuring. Rohin Atavali.
Hi, I'm Rohan. I am a final year medical student starting at Wadham in 2014. I was wondering if you could elaborate, please, on the sort of planned logistics you had back in the start of lockdown when you thought you were going to have to produce a lot of these ventilators in a short amount of time. Specifically on like where you were thinking of sourcing the bag valve mask bags and also where the ventilator would be assembled.
And others will come in on this, but we did envisage that we were going to have to make a lot. So part of the design was we can't use components that are traditional components because we won't be able to source them. So we deliberately designed it with very few components. So the Perspex box we could make in the workshop ourselves, the Ambu bag, the compressible bladder, we could source, and we had a shipping container coming over from China within a couple of days of us deciding that's what we were going to use. There are a few other little things like those what are called Ambu valves, which we had to think about sourcing, and some solenoids. But it was a struggle because that was a real pinch point in our ability to mass produce these things. So we had to design our way around all these obstacles, which is why it was really quite a simple device. It had to be.
Can I just ask, Andrew, I mean, the way you're describing it, it sounds as though there was a tremendous amount of administration required. I mean, importing containers from China doesn't happen by itself. Who was doing all the administrative?
Well, I think Alfonso, I think you were in charge of, you were the quartermaster, weren't you? Was that your job?
Yeah, well, for the first weeks, I was in charge of ordering all these things from all around the world and having discussions pretty much every day with all sorts of distributors. At some point, it grew beyond my capabilities, but that's exactly when Smith and Nephew came in, who got experience doing this. So I did a handover and managed to do this, and they have plans for delivering up to 5,000 a week, I think, after week 3, which was impressive.
Sounds like you should be put in charge of Britain's post-Brexit trade policy.
I shouldn't.
Someone's got to do it. Nicholas Kirkbride.
Hello, I read Human Sciences in the late 70s, 79, I think. Very different sort of question. Was being dropped by the government a good thing in hindsight, or could the continuing involvement of, say, the MHRA really have helped you rather than pushing you towards the FDA?
Yes, it was. We were very disappointed. We were days away from being given MHRA approval for use in the UK. And that would have saved us a huge amount of heartache if the government had allowed us to receive that notice from the MHRA saying there was no objection to use. As it is, the government, well, the timing was not helpful. and then the government also have a different perspective on ventilators from us. They see that lots of people die when you put them on the ventilator, so they think that ventilators aren't a good thing, and so they're also not prepared to support the use of ventilators in DFID, in foreign aid. So that news was what finally prompted Smith and Nephew to leave as well. So it's a difficult question, really. I think things would be a lot different if we had received MHRA approval. Potentially, we would have already, so Smith and Nephew would have had a higher priority on the project, and maybe we'd already have made thousands of ventilators. Certainly, then we would have still have had the problem of where to put them, given that the UK demand turned out to be zero. So yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer. I'm sure others have different perspectives.
If you went back to the MHRA now, would they be compelled to assess it?
Yes, but they would assess it by the normal channels, which take up to 2 years. So the emergency approval was available only during the pandemic situation in the UK.
Okay. John May, you've got a question. John. Is John May with us still?
I am. I didn't realise I was muted.
Okay.
Yeah, I was at Wadham late 60s reading modern languages, so obviously I know a lot about engineering and medicine and various other things as well, but it's never stopped me diving in before. My question was about intellectual property. As I understand it, the OxVent device is deliberately and very successfully simple in concept, doubtless not that simple to actually manufacture. But I'm just wondering, how easy would it be for other people to just pinch your intellectual property and go off and manufacture it in Brazil, in Africa, or wherever, depriving your social enterprise of an income stream? And my interest is in particular on the social enterprise end of things. I'm involved with running a number of charities which need income if they are to do the good work which they're set up to do. And I know a social enterprise isn't supposed to be obsessed with profit, but if you're not getting money coming in, if somebody is ripping you off, two things. One, you don't have any money yourselves to fund future research, and you don't have any money to actually fund the enterprise, because there are costs there, which I hope you personally won't be picking up.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's a question that we tackled within the team only last week, really, thinking about the business model that we need to set up and having advice from all corners, similar to your own, that there needs to be. And I think so. We hired a CEO 2 weeks ago, and I'm sure this was no news to him at all. But it took the team around him a while to catch up, to understand that actually we do need to charge a license fee for providing the manufacturing and design information, as you say, to provide the enterprise with an income stream to fund itself, put into R&D. How we tackle the problem of piracy, I think it's very difficult. I think within the context of the pandemic, that isn't an issue. I think we probably would, the question of sourcing the supply, the components, is probably one that would not be very easy to tackle for a second manufacturer in Brazil or Mexico, I think.
Right.
In the longer term, it would be very easy, obviously, to reverse engineer a device, and for somewhere to set up making exactly the same device and undercutting us. So I guess we haven't put enough thought into what we might do to mitigate that.
Okay.
Because actually it sounds as though potentially there could be a very large market for this machine, which means that somebody could make a lot of money out of it.
Right.
Yeah. Abigail Khan has a question.
Hi, I'm Abigail Khan. I studied medicine 2001 till 2007, and I'm a GP. I was just wondering how confident you are / the government are that we won't need OxVent for a second or winter wave, say we get a much worse spike at some point.
Well, I mean, it's entirely plausible that we might get a second wave, but I think in the UK, I think it would be unlikely that the MHRA would, having once refused or closed its emergency approval process, suddenly reopen it again. I suspect in the meantime, the likes of Penlon and Smiths, or whatever, the established ventilator manufacturers will be secretly upscaling their manufacturing process so that they could push a button and make some more in a hurry if they needed to. I suspect that's the way it would go. I'd be surprised if the MHRA knocked on our door and said, "Oh, by the way, we were a bit hasty last time."
The government has built up its stock of ventilators, hasn't it? Doesn't the NHS build up its stock?
It hasn't, surprisingly. It's only still produced 2,000 since the start of all this. So you would have thought they would have been stocking a warehouse somewhere with them, but they haven't. They've only made 2,000.
So they must have made the assessment that a second wave wouldn't require any more than the first wave. Well, that's a nice bet. Yeah. Okay. Are there any if this kind of thing you want to bet on, is there any other questions?
I guess can I offer additional thought on the very helpful question about piracy, which is about know-how. So I think as well as the design itself, which is clearly part of the IP, I think the manufacturing itself is a key part of the rapidity, which is the unique selling point of this. And in order to make things very quickly, you will need the consultancy from OxVent, and you will need information about how to set up the manufacturing. So I think that would be how we might protect it. But thank you for the very interesting question.
Yeah, well, it's an obvious risk, isn't it?
Can I just come back on that? My one thought just going through my mind is that since you aren't in it to make money, you're not a commercial organisation, whether you might somehow just, well, I would have said this, I think, before you made your comment about the know-how, whether you could just give it to the world free. But I think that's perhaps a bit naive if you need know-how as well as designs. That's maybe not quite such a good idea. So I won't make that comment after all.
Okay. It's obviously a very important point there. Also, it's food for the lawyers, Mark. So that's
right.
Yeah. Okay. Do we have any other questions? Okay. Well, I think it's been a really interesting session. Can I repeat that I am personally, and I'm sure everyone on this call is full of admiration for what you achieved so quickly at a time of real national emergency, actually. I mean, at the time you started doing this, it looked as though many people were going to lose their lives for lack of ventilators. And so I think what you did was absolutely tremendous. And I think it's a great shame that at a time when there is a global pandemic, the government can't find a way for our regulator to give swift approval to machines that might be useful globally. I think that's a great shame and a bit depressing. But I think it's obviously been the most wonderful project. So congratulations to all of you. And you're obviously all multitasking during this, and doing things you hadn't done before, and that's always quite good fun. But thank you very much for sharing it with us. And I think Modern's proud of you. And no doubt King's is proud of you, Freddie. And we're proud of you too, because you're going to be a visiting fellow next term. But thank you all very much. And thank you everyone for attending. We're going to have a few other events, I think, in the future, virtual Modern Wednesdays or virtual other days. So please do keep visiting our website, because you'll see them advertised. And it's a very good way for everyone to stay in touch. And I hope that they are events which you find interesting and intellectually stimulating. So thank you all for joining us. Stay well, stay healthy, and we hope to see you all in Oxford sooner rather than later.